friends. I wanted to do a quick lesson today to go along with 2.2.3 to discuss some of the terminology that's listed at the top of your assignment there. So I love genetics. It's like one of my favorite units. So I hope that you really like to study and learn about genetics too, and how traits are passed down from parents to offspring and then through generations as well. So when we talk about genetics, we need to discuss some terminology. So the first piece of terminology here is the genotype. And this is the code, that got cut off, the code that exists on the genes, okay? And so when we talk about genotype, we are looking at letters, okay? So you can have a genotype of big A, big A. You can have a genotype of big A, little a. Or you can have a genotype of little a, okay? And so this determines whether you have a certain trait or don't have a certain trait, okay? So I'm going to jump down just a little bit to discuss some more of these terms. This and this is homozygous. Okay? Homozygous means having two of the same alleles. Now you're like, what is an allele, Miss Brown? An allele is a form of a gene. Okay? An allele is a form of a gene. It's a variant. Okay? So you can have an allele for, let's say, roll your tongue. Okay? Can anybody in this class roll their tongue? I can roll my tongue. So tongue rolling is a dominant trait. So people that have, people that can roll their tongue have a dominant allele. A dominant allele is a big A, okay? A recessive allele is a little a, okay? A recessive allele is masked by the dominant allele. So in order to have a recessive trait, you have to be little a, okay? I can roll my tongue. So we would say that tongue rollers, because tongue rolling is a dominant trait, tongue rollers are big A, or big A, little a. Non-rollers are little a. They have to have two copies of the recessive allele to display the non-rolling trait, okay? But to be a tongue roller, the dominant trait is always going to supersede the recessive trait, okay? These guys right here, these big A, little a's, those are called a heterozygous or a heterozygote, okay? So they have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Hetero has one dominant allele and one recessive allele, such as big A, little a. Okay? Heterozygotes are sometimes referred to as carriers. Okay? So what a carrier is some traits are, some genetic disorders are recessive disorders. So for example, cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a disease of the lungs and the respiratory system. Individuals, you're born with it, but with cystic fibrosis, they have a really hard time breathing. They have a mucus that builds up on their lungs, a really thick mucus that builds up on their lungs because they don't have the enzyme that breaks down that mucus in their body. And so it is a recessive disorder. So somebody with little a would have cystic fibrosis. Okay? So back home, I have two friends, Sean and Morgan are their names, and they have 3 children, but their oldest child, Paxton, has cystic fibrosis. But Sean and Morgan are both normal, okay? So Sean must be big A, little a, and Morgan must also be big A, little a. And so Sean must have donated his little a to Paxton, and Morgan must have also donated her little a to Paxton. And so Paxton then has little a, little a. Okay? Tomorrow we will learn about Punnett squares. I don't know if you did Punnett squares in middle school at all, but we can frequently use a Punnett square to show genetic inheritance. Actually, I think it's on Thursday that we'll learn about Punnett squares. And so we put the mom or the dad, it doesn't matter which one goes on top. One parent goes on the top and one parent goes on the side, whichever one you want to do. And you just bring their alleles in to meet them up together. So when you complete the square, if this was the square for Sean, my friends Sean and Morgan, you see that they had a 25% chance of having somebody with a recessive trait, okay? And so their child, Paxton, had the recessive trait, and he has cystic fibrosis. Now, they have 2 other girls that do not have cystic fibrosis. They are normal. And so for Sean and Morgan, it was a 75% chance that they would have a normal child that's big A, or big A, little a, and a 25% chance that they would have a cystic fibrosis child. Okay? So Sean and Morgan are considered to be carriers because they carry the allele for cystic fibrosis. Neither of them show that trait. Neither of them have cystic fibrosis, but they can carry it on to their child. Okay? Now, we could do a different Punnett square. Let's just say this is Sean and this is Morgan. But let's say that Morgan was not big A, little a. Let's say that Morgan was big A, big A. Okay, so she still is normal. She still doesn't have cystic fibrosis. And Sean is the carrier. Okay, so we'll put Morgan on top and Sean on the side, and we'll fill in our Punnett square. Okay, whoops. And what we see here is that 100% of the children would be normal. None of them would have cystic fibrosis in that incidence. Okay, so it takes 2 carriers to have a probability for having cystic fibrosis. If you just have 1 carrier, you're not going to have a recessive disorder. Okay, now some disorders are dominant. Okay, just because it's a dominant disorder, though, does not mean that it's dominant in the population. So, for example, polydactyly. That means having more than 5 fingers and 5 toes on each hand. Polydactyly is a dominant trait. But as far as I know, there's nobody in our class, and none of my former students that I've had that I'm aware of have more than 5 fingers or 5 toes. But that's a dominant trait. So that means all of us, since we have the normal number of fingers, have to be, for this trait, I'm going to use F to say fingers. You can use any letter you want. It doesn't matter. I'm sorry. We have to all be little f, little f. Okay? For somebody to have 6 fingers, they would have to be big F, or big F, little f. Okay? So that's a dominant disorder. So it depends if the disorder is dominant or recessive, how you write the trait. Okay? That is important. All right. Now, the last thing, I want to talk about is phenotype. Okay. So we talked about genotype, and we've talked about phenotype too. We just didn't say it as such. Okay. So the genotype for cystic fibrosis, we would say is little a, little a. The phenotype is cystic fibrosis. It's what you see. It's the physical trait. It's what you see, okay? So if the genotype was big A, little a, we would say normal, okay? If we use our F's, big F, we would say polydactyly. I think I spelled that wrong. I'm sure I spelled that wrong, okay? If we did little f, we would say normal. So the phenotype is the physical manifestation of the trait. The genotype is what the alleles say. When it's asking for genotype, you have to give the letters. All right? And so remember, on our chromosomes, you get one chromosome from mom, one chromosome from dad. We have a gene that is a certain spot in a certain locus on the chromosome. The locus is the spot. And so this is a gene that codes for a trait. Okay, let's say the normal trait where you don't get cystic fibrosis, or the trait where you do get cystic fibrosis. And so each chromosome has an allele on it. The one that your mom gives you on one chromosome, and the one that your dad gives you on the other chromosome, okay? And you inherit those two together, and that's how you get the traits, all right? So you have to look at the image of the chromosomes and determine if the person in the picture has NF1 based on their alleles that they received from their parents. So if you have any questions about this, let me know. I'll do a quick lesson a couple other times today just to talk a little bit more about genetics. Y'all have a great day.